Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks always for joining. This week's guest is Arsen Ostrovsky. You may know of him or have seen him, as to quote the Daily Mail, as the Bondi Bandage Man. He was shot in the head during the Bondi terrorist attack, and he took a selfie to see how bad his injury was, sent this photo to his wife, as well as to Twitter, and that image went viral. Now out of hospital, Arsen Ostrovsky has a story to tell. He grew up in Sydney's eastern suburbs where this attack took place, but he's been living in Israel for the last 13 years. He's an international human rights lawyer and moved back home with his wife and two young girls just 2.5 weeks before the attack on December 14 to take up a new job as head of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council's Sydney office. As you will hear in this interview, he is one of the many victims, business figures, opposition political figures, sporting heroes in Australia who are now pushing for a royal commission into antisemitism. Just like in London, Australia has seen huge pro-Palestinian protests where some demonstrators have flown flags of Hezbollah, held up images of the Iranian Ayatollah, and chanted some of the phrases very familiar to us all that are now being outlawed in the UK and New South Wales following Bondi. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who is centre-left, is digging in and refusing this inquiry, and it's probably the most serious test of his leadership so far, particularly if the security situation, God forbid, for Australia's Jews gets any worse. I began by asking Arsen Ostrovsky if he feared a second attack after Bondi.
Look, it's always possible. And unless what we saw on the 14th becomes a turning point, then it may well happen. And we have seen in the last 2 years and a little bit since October 7th, warning after warning after warning to the government, to the security agencies, that if this hate, if this vitriol, if this incitement, if this harassment against the Jewish community continues unchecked, was mainstreamed, excused, or even justified, that would lead to violence. And we saw this deadly manifestation only 2.5 weeks ago. So this must be a watershed moment for us to learn from, to understand not only what happened, but why it happened, importantly, and to ensure that the horrors of December 14th are not repeated.
You said there, unless this is a turning point, what would a turning point look like?
Well, I think the first point is we need to learn. We know what happened, but we need to understand also why it happened. And I think that starts with only a royal commission that can achieve that. And unless we understand the root causes of this unabated surge of anti-Semitism in the last 2+ years against the Jewish community, unless we learn and understand the root causes of it, unless our politicians understand that this was not only a failure of intelligence, but a wholesale failure of leadership across the board, unless appropriate steps are taken in terms of security, in terms of the recommendations that had been in the report of the anti-Semitism envoy, in terms of rooting out the hate preachers. Unless these steps are taken urgently, then there is a real concern that we may continue seeing this further kind of violence against the Jewish community.
You were at Bondi with your children, 2 girls, and your wife.
Yeah.
How old are your girls?
My girls, they'll be turning 5 and 9 soon.
So they were in this attack as well?
They were, like so many other hundreds of families. We went there with my wife and our 2 young daughters to enjoy this beautiful festival. There was face painting, there were pet animals, there were rides and activities. It was a joyous festival. This has nothing to do with politics at all. It was a Jewish festival, it was a community festival. It was to celebrate a Hannukah, this joyous holiday. And just before the attack started, my wife and daughters had gone to sit down because the ceremony was about to start, and I had stepped aside just to get some food, actually. And then I heard this loud bang, and at first I thought that it might have been balloons. There were kids' activities, clowns and so on. So I thought maybe it was a balloon or something like that. But then it was bang, 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 relentless. And in those initial moments, it was complete chaos. People were running, people were falling, the smoke was billowing from the ground. And initially I ducked, but then immediately, of course,
When you say you
yeah.
ducked, did you fall to the ground? So I've done hostility training, and that's the thing they say you should do is obviously get as low as possible. When you duck, do you fall? Like what? How low did you go?
So I went pretty low. So near where I was, there was a sort of like a picnic area with some tables and a cover. Where the park itself was, it was virtually completely in the open. And which is, when we saw the shooters, both from the footbridge and the street path, they had this elevated position and they were literally picking off men, women, children, elderly Holocaust survivors, almost one by one. So near me was sort of a picnic area, part of the park where it would have been maybe meters away for that. So I quickly dashed there and ducked, but very quickly or immediately also understood, my wife and children were in the open. They would have been about 20 or so meters away from me, which meant 20 or so meters closer to the shooter, and they would have had no protection. So immediately I stood up to make a dash towards them, which is when I got hit. And when I got hit, I knew something had happened straight away because it was as if someone turned the faucet on. I was hit in the head and the blood started immediately gushing out. And I put my hand on my head and I could feel the flap of my skin. And I fell to the ground and I started yelling, I'm hit, I'm down. But no one could help me at that moment because there were literally bullets in every direction. This amazing elderly man near me had given me a spare T-shirt he happened to have to help stop the flow of blood. But, at the same time, there are certain things you see in your life that you will not unsee. And, just on the right of me, there was a man who was lying on top of his wife, clearly looked like he was shielding her. His hand was hunched over and he wasn't moving, but you could see the blood slowly going drip, drip, drip. And on the left of me, again, not more than a few meters, were two people, one of whom you could see body parts already. But it was in that moment that the most terrifying thing was not being able to reach my wife, not knowing if her and the children were okay. I tried to call, I couldn't reach her, and I'd taken a picture of myself. And
what possessed you to do that? I mean, if I got shot, I don't know that the thing I would do would be to pull out my phone and document it. What was your instinct and motivation telling you to do that at the time? Do you remember?
Yes, two things. One, it was to see how badly I was hit.
You were
Number
using it
one.
like a mirror.
Yes.
Right.
So one, it was to see also how badly I was hit, and two, send my wife the picture with the words "love you," not knowing if they were the last two words that I would send to her. It was about 10 minutes after that, give or take, that I got a message from her that they were safe. Finally was able to get a hold of her.
God, that's a long 10 minutes.
It was 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. They had actually, my wife, who, she's, probably a lioness and a hero and all this, she took the children and ran with them. And they actually ran towards the beach and they hid there with other families by the sand. But they would have actually ran almost right past me, not knowing that I was there. But again, this is in hindsight, but they would have ran right in the line of sight of the shooters. So it was close on all accounts. And when I got to the hospital, the doctors said it was millimeters between life and death. They said it was a miracle. The bullet grazed my head. It grazed through to the bone, but it was a miracle that I survived. Now, I can't tell you why it was that I survived and a 10-year-old girl, Matilda, did not, or why.
How are you processing that? I mean, do you have survivor's guilt?
There's a lot that I'm trying to absorb and understand. And there's this whirlwind of emotions, but it also feels like a jigsaw puzzle that I'm trying to piece together. And some things are coming together by meeting other people. In some that are saying, we were there too, and I saw you. I got a message from someone who had said that he happened to be in the same picnic area, and he wrote to me that he saw the bullet hit me and he was sure that I was dead. It was only once he saw me on TV that he understood that I was alive still. They're talking with other survivors. It gives us strength. Talking with trauma experts, both here in Australia and also a number of experts from Israel that have come across as well. Look, the scars will heal, and the doctors say it'll be a full physical recovery. But the mental scars, they take time. We moved from Israel only a few weeks before the attack, and we lived through October 7th, through wars, specifically the war with Iran in June. So we've seen horror, we've seen war, and this was meant to be in so many ways. This is Australia. This isn't the Middle East, and it looked like it was an absolute war zone. But again, it wasn't Israel or Gaza. This was Bondi Beach.
So your little girls are quite young, but they've grown up in Israel. So they obviously have an understanding, I guess, of conflict and what it means to be Jewish and targeted. How have you told them about what they were caught up in at Bondi and what happens to Dad and why he went to hospital?
Yeah. My girls have seen more than any child ought to ever see. They've been going in and out of bomb shelters. At one point, my older daughter, she would put her slippers at a certain angle near the door, knowing that if there's going to be an alarm in the middle of the night and we have to rush down to the bomb shelter, that she can put her feet in her slippers as fast as she can to help her. So that sadly they have become far too accustomed to conflict. And actually, when we told them that we were relocating to Australia, my daughter said to me, "Abba, Daddy, does that mean no more boomies?" Meaning no more rocket sirens. And I said, "No, sweetie, we're going to Australia. It's a long way away." And it feels, you in some ways you've let down you've let down your child, but these kids just extraordinarily resilient. And they knew straight away that they have to follow mum, they have to rush, which they did. But it's still confronting. Obviously, you want to shield your children in terms of the information which they're receiving. And this is a story that's been relentless, every minute of every hour of every day since it happened. So you want to shield them, but it's impossible in this day and age of social media, and it is quite confronting. And when they see the images of me, and when they know that I spent 3-4 days in hospital, so they know that something serious happened. But we're speaking with them, and
They know that you
it's a
got
long
shot.
process.
Did you
They
tell
do
them?
know.
Yeah.
They do know that I got shot. Yeah.
And how did you explain the actions of the gunman? Have you tried?
Have I tried? I've tried. My kids are the older one, she's incredibly mature for her age. In part, I think that comes from the lived experiences of Israel, and knowing in some respects what her father does and the kind of work and advocacy. I told her there's only so much one wants to share with a child, the horrors and the monstrosity of what happened. But I said, there was a bad man that tried to harm us, that some people were hurt, but that, that I'm okay, that she, her sister, and her mother, that they're okay, and that, we have important work to do, and we're going to continue living our lives. But they still have questions, lingering questions that pop up, and some that are delayed from things maybe they recalled or remembered, or experiences that they're asking. So it's a conversation that we're having, and it's a conversation so many in our community are having, because it's it's a relatively small community, and everyone knows someone, and certainly at that event, and the way that the community has rallied around us, the victims' families, the survivors. And when I say the community, I should say it's not just the way the Jewish communities come together, but the broader community in Bondi, in Sydney, obviously in Australia as well, but especially here in Sydney, has been just, remarkable. And I think people are understanding that even though this was a direct assault against us because we were Jews and Jewish Australians, this was ultimately an attack on Australia as a whole, because when you target one part of the community, it's as if I think it's an attack on the nation as a whole. So I think we saw that in Bondi, and I think that's an important message, that this isn't just a Jewish issue. This is an issue for Australia as a whole, because this hatred, which is like a cancer, it's eating away at our very social fabric and the values of freedom, tolerance, democracy. And unless we root that out, it will continue eating away at that.
You grew up in this area around Bondi, yes?
I did. This is, I grew up here. This is, this Bondi was my home. This was my beach. These, my people, my community as well. Yeah.
So 13 years abroad, coming back, obviously this has happened to you within weeks of returning home, but do you feel that the country has changed, or do you feel that this is more an isolated incident or something that is contained within the broader context about what is actually taking place in Israel at the moment?
I don't think I don't think it's an isolated incident, because we have seen, almost daily, weekly basis since October 7th. It was only, in fact, on October 9th, I think it was 2 days after the attacks, when we saw a mob descend on Opera House, and with chants of "Gas the Jews" or "Where are the Jews?" as if one is somehow even worse or better than the other. They're both horribly confronting and unacceptable. And we've been seeing that almost on a daily basis, from our landmarks being hijacked by extremists to synagogues being firebombed, schools being attacked, Jewish property and businesses being forced to shut down. It's been, so this isn't an isolated incident, and it's not something that is on the margins. And I think when you saw some of the scenes from Bondi, it wasn't just those of us celebrating the park. When you saw the people literally fleeing, thousands of people fleeing Bondi Beach, I think it was understood that this is the word. This is, I think, the highest, not the highest. This is the worst terrorist incident on Australian soil. And I'm not sure about, if I can't recall who I spoke with, whether it was with you or someone else, that whether outside of October 7th, and I think it's the synagogue attack in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life a couple of years ago, whether this was the most number of Jews killed in any one incident outside of Israel since the Holocaust itself. But I think in many ways this has been a turning point, and we have seen the extraordinary reaction from the country. This isn't not just from the Jewish community. We day after day, and especially when talking about the calls for Royal Commission, we've seen business leaders, we've seen legal professionals, we've seen former military leaders, governor generals come out and say we have to get to the root of not only what happened, but why it happened. So I do think in many ways this has been a turning point, and this really must be a watershed moment. Again, if we are to honour the memory of the victims, and the best way to do that is to ensure that the horrors of what happened are not allowed to repeat again. I don't think the Jewish community is asking for any special treatment here at all, but as Jewish Australians, and as any Australian, we're entitled to the most basic right, which is the right to live in freedom.
What do you want the Royal Commission to investigate exactly?
No, the terms of the review, which the Prime Minister has announced, and with all due respect to Dennis Richardson,
this is a separate review into the intelligence agencies and what they knew and how in the lead up to the attack. Yeah,
correct. Mr. Richardson is someone with impeccable credentials, but the mandate which he has been presented with is woefully inadequate, because this wasn't just an intelligence failure, which it was, but this was a wholesale failure of leadership. And we have to understand not only what happened, but how it happened. And anti-Semitism is not something that has been defined to the fringes. It is something that has become entirely mainstream. It is also something that is not geographically confined to Sydney. It has spread like a cancer throughout the country. So this can't be just a New South Wales issue. It can't be just an intelligence issue. We need to understand how this virus has spread throughout our institutions, throughout the media, throughout social media spaces. So I think it's important to understand what happened, how it happened, and what lessons need to be taken to ensure that it does not happen again.
So one of the reasons that the federal government of Australia has given for not holding a royal commission into what I understand from your answer there is the broad growth of antisemitism across Australia leading up to this attack, is that it would platform the anti-Semites, the very people who are responsible for perhaps the conditions in which this attack occurred. Is that something that you need to be protected on, the platforming of such bigots or anti-Semitic people?
Look, I think those bigots and haters need to be exposed, and they have been platformed throughout the last 2 years. But, I think this analogy is somewhat disingenuous because, it's no different to someone saying, my apologies, I'm not sure who it was that where I heard this, but it's as if saying, well, we shouldn't have had the Nuremberg trials because that would have platformed the Nazis. Now, we need to get to the root cause of how this was allowed to happen, how this hatred was allowed to fester. And the government itself bears an incredible onus and responsibility. Now, the Albanese government has also said that they have listened to the security chiefs and experts who have advised against holding the Royal Commission. And we have to ask, are these not the same security experts and chiefs under whose watch the attack was allowed to happen? The experts, which they need to be listening to, are the victims' families and the survivors first and foremost who are calling for this. But we've now seen former army chief, we've seen the former head of the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, former Governor John Peter Cosgrove himself, a highly decorated soldier. So we're seeing some most eminent legal professionals as well, and not just business leaders today also, who are calling and pleading for this, for the Royal Commission, because ultimately only a Commonwealth Royal Commission with the broadest powers possible can get to the bottom of what happened and how it was allowed to happen. And it's disappointing that the Prime Minister and that the government is refusing to, first and foremost, listen to the victims' families and the survivors, but also this incredible outpouring of calls from across the political spectrum, quite frankly, across all different elements of our legal, business, societal landscape as well. And you have to ask, are they fearful or do they have something to hide? What are they so concerned about that the truth will come out, that perhaps the government's actions themselves had poured more fuel on the fire or had failed to heed the appropriate warnings which were given by the Jewish community? At the end of the day, the government has to take full responsibility.
Do you think that the government is risking further violence by not holding a Royal Commission?
Absolutely, because ultimately without a Royal Commission, we're not going to get to the truth of what happened and be able to learn the full array of lessons that there are to be learned from this, because the review as it is right now is incredibly narrow. It does not even mention the word anti-Semitism, and it is looking at only the intelligence failure, which it was an incredible intelligence failure, but it's far more than that. It was a failure of leadership, and which is why we need to look at all these elements. But in not doing so, then the government does risk that another catastrophic event like this may repeat, and that's something obviously we cannot afford.
You mentioned the incredible widespread support across the political spectrum. And you're right, it is, Australia, I think, does not really want to ever get involved in politics, but we've seen people, including particularly the business community, stand up on this, which to me is quite strong and surprising and very significant. But there has been relative silence from Labor in terms of the backbench. We've had only 2 MPs say they support a Royal Commission. The cabinet is locked in behind the Prime Minister, obviously, out of cabinet solidarity, but there's a whole swathe of backbench Labor MPs who haven't said boo. What do you make of that?
It's deeply disappointing. I think it's cowardly. I think at some point you need to put the interests of the country ahead of your own interests and do what's right. Unfortunately, we've seen too few within the government speaking out. We have seen a number of courageous voices, including the Human Rights Commissioner, just the other day actually speak out and call for a royal commission. I believe she's the first current sitting government-appointed senior official to do so, and all the respect to her. But I would hope to see that others will, first and foremost, really listen to the victims' families, listen to the survivors who are pleading with the government to listen to us. But these pleas are falling on deaf ears.
Do you think the actions of the Netanyahu government, and taking into account the particularly abhorrent views of some of the far-right ministers in that government, have made Jewish people abroad vulnerable?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that often is invoked perhaps as an excuse, but the people that are responsible for this, those that fired those rifles, those that enabled and supported them, those that refused to heed warnings that this radical jihadist threat was a serious concern here in Australia, that pouring more fuel on this rhetoric of seeing these marches after marches calling to globalize the intifada, that if this kind of hate was left unchecked, it would come to the boil and explode in a tragic event like this. What is happening in Israel, I don't think is connected to the actions that the terrorists took, but they are using that abhorrently as an excuse to justify their actions, which of course are completely unjustifiable.
There's obviously been a big breakdown in the relationship between the Netanyahu government and the Australian government. Do you think that's repairable?
Look, I'm an optimist. I think the relations between Australia and Israel, historic, go back for decades. Unfortunately, we have seen this relationship become increasingly strained, and it became strained long before even October 7th. When the Albanese government was elected, it immediately walked back a number of steps that the previous, I think, Liberal government took, including the recognition of even West Jerusalem, including votes at the UN as well. So I think this was already a process that we sort of the undoing of what had been for decades a very strong bipartisan relationship really started to be undone long before October 7th, regrettably. And, I think for a lot of, it's not just something that is deeply painful to see for the Jewish community here, but I think it's deeply unfortunate for Australia as a whole, because I think having that strong relationship with Israel is also in Australia's best interests in terms of security perspective, in terms of intelligence sharing perspective, in terms of trade. Australia faces many security threats itself, including from Iran, as we saw only a few months ago with the ambassador being kicked out and the IRGC being designated as a terrorist group. So I think on the contrary, instead of these kinds of perhaps misguided or counterproductive actions, I think a closer cooperation with Israel is actually in Australia's best interests.
Have you been surprised by the reaction abroad to what took place at Bondi? It has been overwhelming, the strength of interest, but shock, horror, compassion, obviously. But I've been really taken aback how many people in my network here in London, also in Europe, in the United States, have been like, oh my goodness, this attack has really cut through to them. Are you surprised by that?
No, the magnitude of what happened was just so horrific. The pictures and images were so incredibly jarring that it's understandable that there is such a deep interest in what happened. But we're also, when we're seeing this scourge of anti-Semitism really ravaging worldwide, in Europe, in North America, that there is a sense of connection to what is happening, whether it's in the US, in Canada, even in the UK. One of my dear friends, he's one of the Jewish leaders in Manchester. And it was only after this attack he reminded me that my last message to him was just after the Yom Kippur attack on the synagogue in Manchester, that I messaged him, "Are you okay?" And he showed me afterwards, his last message to me was on December 14th after the attack here, asking me if I was okay. That was our last exchange. So, I think there's also that understanding that what happens here, and when we see such attacks against Jews, when we see this unabated surge and rise in Islamic extremism through Europe and North America, that attacks like this can manifest in horrific catastrophes and tragedies like what we saw in Bondi.
Have you relayed any of this directly to the PM? I mean, I'm sure someone nearly got killed in that attack. You've been able to have a private conversation with him?
So I have been contacted from Israel's side, by the President of Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, the Speaker of the Knesset, the Minister for the Diaspora Affairs actually flew on the first flight from Tel Aviv to Sydney and saw me in hospital. I have spoken now several times. I met with the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns, with the leader of the federal opposition, Susan Ley, and with the opposition leader here in New South Wales, Kelly Sloan, who I should add, on a deeply personal note, was actually at the event, or came to the event whilst the shooting was still happening. And actually, I was one of the people to whom she came to help, which was an extraordinary feat of courage in its own right. But no, the Prime Minister has not reached out to me, nor has anyone from the government reached out, which is incredibly, I would say, disappointing. The Prime Minister saw Ahmed Al-Ahmed in hospital, and as he should have, because Mr. Al-Ahmed is an absolute hero, national treasure, and what he displayed was incredible heroism, as did Boris and Sophia, who were I think the first two who were killed trying to tackle one of the terrorists. But I don't recall the Prime Minister seeing or going to any funeral. I don't recall him seeing any of the Jewish victims from the attack. So it is deeply disappointing, and it, I think, shows honestly at its most basic, a lack of empathy and perhaps some cold indifference, and it is something that's incredibly hurtful. Again, we don't want any kind of special treatment, but as Australians who happen to be Jewish, obviously, we want the same treatment as everyone else. And at the end of the day, Mr. Albanese is the Prime Minister. He is our leader, and the buck stops with him.
What do you think it is driving that? I mean, do you think he's maybe scared of the reaction he might get? Do you think he just doesn't care, or how have you rationalised it? I mean, he did attend the vigil a week after at Bondi, and he was booed and heckled there. Maybe he is worried he wouldn't be welcomed to funerals. He wouldn't be invited to them.
Well, he also, I think, that vigil was a week after the attack, and it was a week of, I suppose, of rejection. So, I was there at the vigil, and I heard the reaction, and it was still very raw for the community. That feeling of almost abandonment from our Prime Minister, from our leader. Now, I don't know exactly what's driving him, whether it is demographic concerns, whether it is policy, whether it is perhaps poor advice that he might be receiving from some of these so-called experts. But whatever it is, I hope the government changes this course fast, because again, this was an attack. This was an attack directed at Jewish Australians, but ultimately it was an attack on our nation as a whole.
Has this caused you in any way to think differently about how you feel about being Australian?
No. What I choose, and I choose to take out of what happened on December 14th, is it's not the heinousness and the evil of these two terrorists, but it is the humanity shown by everyone around. It was people like Ahmed Al-Ahmed. It was people like surf lifesavers who came literally running from the water, including to my own aid. One of them was literally ripping his shirt off to give me as a bandage. It was people like Kelly Sloan, yes, a politician, but there, while still fire was happening to try and help, it was people rushing from across the street. It was the way that we all came together, not only on that moment, but since then. And it's not just the Jewish community that's rallied, it is, so many in our country as a whole. So I choose to take out the basic humanity shown by everyday ordinary Australians who risk their own life to save ours and mine as well. That to me is the real Australia, and that is what we need to fight for, to ensure that this ultimately, that this hate that we saw does not triumph, and that the basic humanity and of our country, of our democracy ultimately prevails. But we need to fight for that to ensure that it does prevail.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also the reaction since in the last 2 weeks, I think has really shown a lot of that too, of what you're talking about. There was a very bizarre incident immediately after this attack where an AI-generated image of you popped up on X showing you purportedly having the blood running down your face being applied by a makeup artist. It was actually a very, very scarily good, realistic image. Where do you think that came from, and what do you think its purpose was?
I received that image, first notice of that image, as I was literally about to be wheeled into the operating theatre in hospital. It was confronting, and in a lot of ways, I don't want to dignify the sick campaign of lies and hate with a comment. However, what I will only insofar as to say that, this wasn't merely a physical attack, but this is also a misinformation attack. And this is also information warfare that we're dealing with. Now, I don't know where these images generated and may have been relentless since it happened. I don't know whether it's an individual or, in more likelihood, it may well be one of the state actors who is perhaps leading this effort to cause, whether it's to cause discord amongst democratic liberal societies like Australia. And we've seen these kinds of campaigns, whether by Qataris or others. But it is confronting. But we also, in looking at this, we also have to look even more broad in terms of the role of social media companies in this, because, these aren't mere words. We've seen what happens when words are unchecked, when misinformation, disinformation is allowed to spread like wildfire. It energizes extremists, it gives them cause for incitement, and it does lead directly to violence. So social media companies have enormous responsibility here to ensure that this is not allowed to proliferate, that they do take action against it, because this does have real life consequences.
In your answer just then, I think you said, I don't know, 3 times, maybe more. Isn't that the point? We should know. We should know where these images are coming from. There should be, technology is capable of providing us with provenance. Is it time that we actually had the ability to say, we need to trace where this image came from? Who, why, what, where, when, how?
100%, absolutely. And I think greater onus needs to be placed on some of these social media companies in order not only to monitor this, to make sure that it doesn't, that when it does come up, that it's immediately flagged and not allowed to continue sort of exploding like a mushroom of disinformation, but that images like these are not allowed to proliferate in the first place. There has to be greater checks. There has to be greater restructuring in the algorithms, and the media companies must know that if they do not take action, that their own inaction will have consequences as well.
Just finally, Arsen,
Yeah.
you must feel like you've had a second shot at life, right?
I know that I survived, and it was a miracle. And it is a second chance of life indeed, which, I never took life for granted. I've always known how precious it is, but when you come so close to death, I think it only underscores that. And, from my perspective, no terrorist, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, or these terrorists that we saw in Bondi, are going to dictate terms to me. So, yes, in many ways, this is a second chance at life, and I'm going to make sure that it counts in order to continue fighting against this scourge of anti-Semitism and for the Australia that I love and that we cherish for.
And would you recommend other Jews in Australia attend Jewish gatherings, go to synagogue, do things which makes them visibly Jewish, I guess?
Absolutely. I would recommend that not only for one of the lessons that I take out of this, and I hope many in the Jewish community do, is to be even more proudly Jewish and even more proudly Zionist, because it really does go to the very core of who we are. But I hope even more non-Jewish Australians recognize this. And, we've seen this through the vigils, we've seen this through people day after day after day coming to Bondi, laying wreaths. Everyday Australians, from everyday Australians to people at the very top of industry and society as well. So I certainly have seen that, and I have felt that, and that overwhelming support and love and embrace from the broader community is something that certainly gives a lot of hope.
Well, that's the perfect note to end on. Arsen Ostrovsky, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.